There is probably one number that's more impactful than any other in determining whether or not you're going to be able to scale your e-commerce brand, and that is your gross margin. Your gross margin is a representation of basically whether or not your product that you're selling has any viability whatsoever. So in this video, we're going to talk about what your gross margin is, how to calculate it, and how to improve it so that you can build a brand that has a potential to scale. Your gross margin is basically a measure of how much profit you're actually generating from the sale of your product. Or in other words, it measures how profitable your product actually is. Calculating it is fairly straightforward. You start off with your net revenue. Your net revenue is your gross sales, less any discounts, less any returns or refunds, and adding in anything you charge for shipping. From that net revenue number, you deduct your cost of goods sold, or your COGS. Calculating your COGS number accurately isn't always super straightforward, but that's a little bit outside the scope of this video, so we'll just assume we have a clean number to work with. So your COGS number will include the cost of your product as well as the cost of shipping that good to the customer. Now, when you deduct your COGS from your net sales, that gives you your gross profit. Your gross profit is how many dollars of profit was left over from selling a product. And then your gross profit divided by your net sales is your gross margin, expressed as a percentage. Gross profit and gross margin are obviously very related numbers, but they tell you slightly different things. Gross margin is a percentage that gives you an idea of the consistency of your profitability as you scale up or down. In general, as you scale up, your gross margin should be getting better, but generally you shouldn't be seeing your gross margin get worse. Your gross profit, though, are the actual dollars in absolute terms that you're getting for all this sales activity, and that's used to cover all of your expenses. So you can strategically choose to allow your gross margin to go down a little bit if it means that you increase volume to the point that you have more gross profit dollars. So point being, they're both important to track. Now, most brand founders are very attentive to their revenue numbers, but they don't pay close attention to their gross profit. However, that can lead to misunderstandings of your business's financial health, and I'll try to explain that with an example. So over here in month one, we have a business that's doing 166K of gross sales. They have 18K of discounts, which gives them net sales of 148K. That amount of product being sold means that they have a $50,000 COGS for that month, which gives them 98,000 of gross profit and 66% of gross margin. Now, let's say in month two, they make a big push to sell more product. Their gross sales go up from 166 to 192, and their net sales go up $4,000 from 148 to 152. But the thing is, they more than doubled their discounts. They did a lot of that extra volume because they were promoting pretty heavily. So their gross sales went up by about 16%, and their net sales also increased, but by about 3% because they more than doubled their discounts. So if you're just focusing on the sales side of the story, then you're happy because at the end of the day, you had more revenue. That's good. However, your COGS is going to be directly correlated with your gross sales. If you sell one more unit that costs you $10, it doesn't matter if you sold that for $100 or $40, it still costs you $10. So in this example, their COGS went from 50K to 58K. And because of that, even though their net revenue went up, their gross profit actually went down from 98K to 94K, and their gross margin went from 66% to 62%. So while things might look good if you look at just the sales side of things, because sales went up, your gross profit actually went down, so you're less profitable. And that's why your gross profit and gross margin matter so much. It determines whether or not all the sales activities you're doing are actually generating money to cover the rest of your expenses. But you can go even deeper with your gross profit analysis. For example, it's extremely valuable to look at your gross margin by channel because each sales channel has a very different cost structure. Let's look at this example where a brand is selling on Shopify, Amazon, and wholesale. Typically, Shopify is going to give you your best gross margin because you're pricing at the price that you want and you don't incur all these additional fees. Amazon is often going to be a little bit of a lower gross margin because there's going to be more pricing pressure. So at best, you're pricing the same as Shopify, but oftentimes it might be a little bit lower. Also, it comes with a 15% commission in most categories, and the FBA shipping fees can sometimes be a bit more expensive than what you're incurring on Shopify. And wholesale will typically have the lowest gross margin because it's priced far lower than when you're selling direct to consumer. But despite the fact that wholesale might have a 19% gross margin compared to Shopify, which is at 51%, that doesn't make wholesale a bad channel. While wholesale's gross margin is lower, it has the potential as a channel to have much higher volume. So oftentimes, once it's scaled up, it can have a much higher gross profit. And gross profit are the actual dollars that you're bringing into your company. So what's important is to look at your gross margin by channel so that you can see the changes in gross margin over time within each channel. If all of this was blended together, you might have an instance where one month, all of a sudden your gross margin on a total basis goes down quite a lot, but that's just because there was a massive wholesale order in that month and wholesale is at a lower gross margin. This sort of visibility can give you a much clearer sense of whether or not a particular channel is actually worth it. And it also tells you which channels you should preferentially invest in growing because of the profitability of that channel. Another really important analysis is to look at your gross profit by product or product category. Especially in certain industries, you can have a fairly large variability in your gross margin by product, such as supplements, beauty, or apparel. Knowing which products are more profitable also informs which ones you should be preferentially pushing through your advertising and sales strategies. Keep in mind that it's not not just about the cost of the product from the manufacturer. You also have to take into consideration the cost of shipping, which can vary a lot from product to product depending on the size and the weight. Most brands will have some sort of free shipping threshold, like spend a minimum of $50, but they don't also have, but it has to be less than 7 pounds. So if the products you're selling are heavy, they might be costing you more than you realize. So with all that being said, how do we actually improve our gross profit? Well, there are 3 main approaches. The first one's simple enough, and that's just to increase your prices. Of course, you might be thinking, well, yeah, sure, I would increase my prices if I could, but if I do, I'll have fewer customers. But that's the thing, with higher prices, each customer will be more profitable. So there is a bit of a trade-off where you'll take fewer customers if that means the remaining ones are going to be more profitable. So let's look at this example. Here we have in scenario 1, 2,300 units being sold. The price is about $65 each, so that gives us $150,000 of sales. Our cost for each unit is $20, so that gives us $46,000 of COGS. That gives us $103,000 of gross profit and a 69% gross margin. Now in scenario 2, perfect scenario, I just jack up my prices from $64.95 to $74.95, so that means my total sales go from $150 to $172. My COGS stay the same, so my gross profit goes from $103 to $126, and my gross margin goes from 69% to 73%. But like we said, realistically, you're going to lose some customers, so how many customers can you afford to lose? So in scenario 3, let's say I increase my prices by the same amount. However, instead of having 2,300 orders, I now sold 2,000. 2,000 orders at $75 is the same amount of revenue as 2,300 orders at $65. However, in scenario 3, because I'm selling fewer units, my COGS is $40K instead of $46K, which means my gross profit is $110K instead of $103K. And that also means that I have a 73% gross margin instead of a 69% gross margin. So here, if you are strategic about increasing your prices, even if you lose customers, that actually means that you end up being more profitable. The second component to improve is obviously going to be your costs. You can reduce your cost per unit by negotiating with your manufacturer, switching suppliers, assuming that doesn't affect your quality too much, or just by increasing your transaction volumes, or larger orders with the manufacturer, or bigger volumes of shipments. So now looking at the same example, in scenario 2, I'm still selling 2,300 units at $65 a pop, but here my cost per unit is $17 instead of $20. That means my COGS goes from $46K to $39K, my gross profit goes up from $103 to $110, and my gross margin goes from 69% to 74%. This is why it's so important to focus not just on your revenue, but the cost of your goods as well. As you're able to scale and get those cost per units down and negotiate better shipping agreements, you can find a lot more profit for the same amount of revenue. And the third thing is a tricky one, but it's your product mix. Analyzing your gross profit by product and making decisions accordingly can help you eke out more gross profit on an overall basis. So if we look at this example over here, you can see the sales for 4 products, their corresponding gross profits and gross margins. Your total gross profit is $162K and your total gross margin is 56%. Now looking at this, product C has the highest sales, but it also has the lowest gross margin. What we decide to do with product C is very much dependent on how we think our customers will react and if they're going to leave entirely or shift to other products. So you have to deeply understand your customers' behaviors and what the different products mean to them. If product C is completely different a product than the rest of them and it's attracting a completely different set of customers, then in that scenario, it might be that if you remove product C, you lose those customers entirely. If that's the case, then even though the gross margin for product C is very low, at the end of the day, it's still more gross profit dollars that you wouldn't otherwise have. So you may as well keep the product. However, let's say that if we remove the product, we wouldn't keep 100% of those customers, but let's say 70% of them would shift over to product A. So that's what we have in the second scenario. We lose all of product C's sales. However, 70% of that is added to product A. Our sales go down from 290K to 252K. However, because product A is a higher margin product, our gross profit is higher. So now our total gross profit is 184K instead of 162K. And our overall gross margin has improved from 56% to 73%. While the example here is a bit aggressive because you typically won't have such massive spreads in your gross margins, it's more to illustrate the point. If you're doing $10,000 of sales a month, then little differences in gross margins aren't going to make a huge difference. But when you scale up to $10 million, then these decisions really matter. So understanding the profitability of different sales channels and of different products and how those products matter to your customers is crucial to make good financial decisions. Of course, being able to have visibility of your performance on a channel by channel basis means you need to have good accounting. So if you need any help with the bookkeeping for your e-commerce brand, we're an e-commerce accounting firm, feel free to reach out for help. Or in the meantime, you might enjoy this video on the 10 pricing tactics you can use to increase your prices to improve your gross margin. But other than that, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.